Hello, welcome back. Let's read some more. I start to get tired. Let's read this flying boat. But I was to read about India. The country India. But I like this seaplanes. I like seaplanes and old flying boats.
Flying boat. This article needs additional citations for verification. Please help improve this article by adding citations to reliable sources. Unsourced material may be challenged and removed. Find sources: Flying Boat News, Times Newspapers, Times Books, Times Scholar, Times Chester, July 2013. Learn how and when to remove this template message. A flying boat is a type of fixed-winged seaplane with a hull, allowing it to land on water. It differs from a float plane in having a fuselage that is purpose-designed for flotation, while float planes rely on fuselage-mounted floats for buoyancy. Though a flying boat's fuselage provides buoyancy, it may also utilize underwing floats or wing-like hull projections, called sponsons, for additional stability. Ascending into common use during the First World War, flying boats rapidly grew in both scale and capability during the interwar period, during which time numerous operators found commercial success with the type. Flying boats were some of the largest aircraft of the first half of the 20th century, exceeded in size only by bombers developed during the Second World War. Their advantage lay in using water instead of expensive land-based runways, making them the basis for international airlines in the interwar period. They were also commonly used as maritime patrol aircraft and air-sea rescue, particularly during times of conflict. Flying boats such as the PBY Catalina and Short Sunderland played key roles in both the Pacific Theater and the Atlantic of the Second World War. The popularity of flying boats gradually tailed off during the Cold War era, partially because of the difficulty in maintaining operations in inclement weather when sea conditions may easily prevent taking off and landing while land-based aircraft are unaffected, and investments in airports during the conflict that eased the introduction of larger, and more efficient, land-based airliners. Despite being largely overshadowed, limited use of the type continued with some operators, such as in the case of the Shilmawa US-1 and the Martin JRM Mars. In the 21st century, flying boats maintain a few niche uses, such as dropping water on forest fires, air transport around archipelagos, and access to undeveloped areas. Many modern seaplane variants, whether float or flying boat types, are convertible amphibious aircraft where either landing gear or flotation modes may be used to land and take off. History, edit. Early float planes, edit. The quest for an aircraft that could take off or land from water began with float planes, which are not flying boats. The Frenchman Alphonse Pinard filed the first patent for a flying machine with a boat hull and retractable landing gear in 1876 but failed to build one. Austrian Wilhelm Kress is credited by some with attempting to build the first successful seaplane Drachenflieger, a float plane, in 1898, although its 230 HP Daimler engines were inadequate for takeoff and it later sank when one of its two floats collapsed. On the 6th of June, 1905, Gabriel Vrazin took off and landed on the River Seine with a towed kite glider on floats. The first of his unpowered flights was 150 yards. He later built a powered float plane in partnership with Louis Blériot, but the machine was unsuccessful. Other pioneers also attempted to attach floats to aircraft in Britain, Australia, France and the USA. On the 28th of March, 1910, Frenchman Henri Fabre flew the first successful powered float plane, the Gnome Omega-powered Hydravion, a trimaran float plane. Fabre's first successful takeoff and landing by a powered float plane inspired other aviators, and he designed floats for several other flyers. The first hydro-aeroplane competition was held in Monaco in March 1912, featuring aircraft using floats from Fabre, Curtiss, Tellier and Farman. This led to the first scheduled seaplane passenger services at Aix-les-Bains, using a 5-seat Sanchez Bissa from the 1st of August 1912. The French Navy ordered its first float plane in 1912. None of these crafts to date were flying boats. In 1911-12, François Denhaut constructed the first flying boat, with a fuselage forming a hull, using various designs to give hydrodynamic lift at takeoff. Its first successful flight was on the 13th of April, 1912. Throughout 1910 and 1911, American pioneering aviator Glenn Curtiss developed his float plane into the successful Curtiss Model D land plane, which used a larger central float and sponsons. Combining floats with wheels, he made the first amphibian flights in February 1911 and was awarded the first Collier Trophy for U.S. flight achievement. From 1912 his experiments resulted in the 1913 Model E and Model F, which he called flying boats. In February 1911, the United States Navy took delivery of the Curtiss Model E, and soon tested landings on and takeoffs from ships using the Curtiss Model D. In Britain, Captain Edward Wakefield and Oscar Nospelius began to explore the feasibility of flight from water in 1908. They decided to make use of Windermere in the Lake District, England's largest lake, to test their float plane. The latter's first attempts to fly attracted large crowds, though the aircraft failed to take off and required a redesign of the floats incorporating features of Boeing's successful speedboat hulls. Meanwhile, Wakefield ordered a float plane similar to the design of the 1910 Fabre Hydravion. By November 1911, both Nospelius and Wakefield had aircraft capable of flight from water and awaited suitable weather conditions. Nospelius's flight was short-lived as the aircraft crashed into the lake. Wakefield's pilot, however, taking advantage of a light northerly wind, successfully took off and flew at a height of 50 feet to Ferry Lab, where he made a wide turn and returned for a perfect landing on the lake's surface. Birth of an Industry, edit. In 1913, the Daily Mail newspaper put up a £10,000 prize for the first non-stop aerial crossing of the Atlantic, which was soon enhanced by a further sum from the Women's Aerial League of Great Britain. American businessman Rodman Wanamaker became determined that the prize should go to an American aircraft and commissioned the Curtiss Aeroplane and Motor Company to design and build an aircraft capable of making the flight. Curtiss' development of the Flying Fish flying boat in 1913 brought him into contact with John Cyril Porte, a retired Royal Navy lieutenant, aircraft designer and test pilot who was to become an influential British aviation pioneer. Recognizing that many of the early accidents were attributable to a poor understanding of handling while in contact with the water, the pair's efforts went into developing practical hull designs to make the transatlantic crossing possible. At the same time, the British boat-building firm J. Samuel White of Cowes on the Isle of Wight set up a new aircraft division and produced a flying boat in the United Kingdom. This was displayed at the London Air Show at Olympia in 1913. In that same year, a collaboration between the S.E. Saunders Boatyard of East Cowes and the Sopwith Aviation Company produced the Bat Boat, an aircraft with a consumer laminated hull that could operate from land or on water. which today we call an amphibious aircraft. The Batboat completed several landings on sea and on land and was duly awarded the Mortimer Singer Prize. It was the first all-British aeroplane capable of making 6 return flights over 5 miles within 5 hours. In the U.S. Wanamaker's Commission built on Glenn Curtiss' previous development and experience with the Model F for the U.S. Navy, which rapidly resulted in the America, designed under Porte's supervision following his study and rearrangement of the flight plan. The aircraft was a conventional biplane design with 2 bay, unstaggered wings of unequal span with 2 pusher inline engines mounted side by side above the fuselage in the interplane gap. Wingtip pontoons were attached directly below the lower wings near their tips. The design, later developed into the Model H, resembled Curtiss' earlier flying boats, but was built considerably larger so it could carry enough fuel to cover 1,100 mi, 1,800 kilometers. The 3 crew members were accommodated in a fully enclosed cabin. Trials of the America began on the 23rd of June, 1914 with Porte also as chief test pilot. Testing soon revealed serious shortcomings in the design. It was underpowered, so the engines were replaced with more powerful engines mounted in a tractor configuration. There was also a tendency for the nose of the aircraft to try to submerge as engine power increased while taxiing on water. This phenomenon had not been encountered before, since Curtiss' earlier designs had not used such powerful engines nor large fuel forward/cargo loads and so were relatively more buoyant. In order to counteract this effect, Curtiss fitted fins to the sides of the boat to add hydrodynamic lift, but soon replaced these with sponsons, a type of underwater pontoon mounted in pairs on either side of a hull. These sponsons, or their engineering equivalents, and the flared, notched hull would remain a prominent feature of flying boat hull design in the decades to follow. With the problem resolved, preparations for the crossing resumed. While the craft was found to handle heavily on takeoff, and required rather longer takeoff distances than expected, the full moon on the 5th of August, 1914 was selected for the transatlantic flight. Porte was to pilot the America with George Hallett as co-pilot and mechanic. First World War, edit. Curtiss and Porte's plans were interrupted by the outbreak of the First World War. Porte sailed for England on the 4th of August, 1914 and rejoined the Navy, as a member of the Royal Naval Air Service. Appointed squadron commander of Royal Navy Air Station Hendon, he soon convinced the Admiralty of the potential of flying boats and was put in charge of the Naval Air Station at Felixstowe in 1915. Porte persuaded the Admiralty to commandeer, and later, purchase, the America and a sister craft from Curtiss. This was followed by an order for 12 more similar aircraft, one Model H-2 and the remaining as Model H-4S. 4 examples of the latter were assembled in the UK by Saunders. All of these were similar to the design of the America and, indeed, were all referred to as Americas in Royal Navy service. The engines, however, were changed from the underpowered 160 HP Curtiss engines to 250 HP Rolls-Royce Vulcan engines. The initial batch was followed by an order for 50 more, totaling 64 Americas overall during the war. Porte also acquired permission to modify and experiment with the Curtiss aircraft. The Curtiss H-4S were soon found to have a number of problems. They were underpowered, their hulls were too weak for sustained operations and they had poor handling characteristics when afloat or taking off. One flying boat pilot, Major Theodore Douglas Hallam, wrote that they were comic machines, weighing well under 2 tons, with 2 comic engines giving, when they functioned, 180 horsepower, and comic control, being nose-heavy with engines on and tail-heavy in a glide. Felixstowe F.20, the first production flying boat, and the basis for future development. At Felixstowe, Porte made advances in flying boat design and developed a practical hull design with the distinctive Felixstowe notch. Porte's first design to be implemented in Felixstowe was the Felixstowe Porte Baby, a large, three-engined biplane flying boat, powered by one central pusher and two outboard tractor Rolls-Royce Eagle engines. Porte modified an H4 with a new hull whose improved hydrodynamic qualities made taxiing, takeoff and landing much more practical, and called it the Felixstowe F.1. Porte's innovation of the Felixstowe notch enabled the craft to overcome suction from the water more quickly and break free for flight much more easily. This made operating the craft far safer and more reliable, although similar devices had been in use in France since 1911. The notch breakthrough would soon after evolve into a step, with the rear section of the lower hull sharply recessed above the forward lower hull section, and that characteristic became a feature of both flying boat hulls and floatplane floats. The resulting aircraft would be large enough to carry sufficient fuel to fly long distances and could berth alongside ships to take on more fuel. Porte then designed a similar hull for the larger Curtiss H-12 flying boat which, while larger and more capable than the H-4S, shared failings of a weak hull and poor water handling. The combination of the new Porte-designed hull, this time fitted with two steps, with the wings of the H-12 and a new tail, and powered by two Rolls-Royce Eagle engines, was named the Felixstowe F.2 and first flew in July 1916, proving greatly superior to the Curtiss on which it was based. It was used as the basis for all future designs. It entered production as the Felixstowe F.2, being used as a patrol aircraft, with about 100 being completed by the end of World War I. Another 70 were built, and these were followed by two F.2C, which were built at Felixstowe. The Felixstowe F.5 was intended to combine the good qualities of the F.2 and F.3, with the prototype first flying in May 1918. The prototype showed superior qualities to its predecessors but, to ease production, the production version was modified to make extensive use of components from the F.3, which resulted in lower performance than the F.2 or F.3. The Felixstowe flying boats were extensively employed by the Royal Navy for coastal patrols, including searching for German U-boats. In 1918 they were towed on lighters towards the northern German ports to extend their range. On the 4th of June, 1918 this resulted in 3 F.2s engaging with 10 German seaplanes, shooting down 2 confirmed and 4 probables at no loss. As a result of this action, British flying boats were dazzle-painted to aid identification in combat. The Curtiss Aeroplane and Motor Company independently developed its designs into the small Model F, the larger Model K, several of which were sold to the Russian Naval Air Service, and the Model C for the US Navy. Curtiss among others also built the Felixstowe F.5 as the Curtiss F5L, based on the final Porte hull designs and powered by American Liberty engines. Meanwhile, the pioneering flying boat designs of François Denhaut had been steadily developed by the Franco-British Aviation Company into a range of practical craft. Smaller than the Felixstows, several thousand FBAs served with almost all of the Allied forces as reconnaissance craft, patrolling the North Sea, Atlantic and Mediterranean oceans. In Italy, several flying boats were developed, starting with the L series, and progressing with the M series. The Macchi M.5 in particular was extremely maneuverable and agile and matched the land-based aircraft it had to fight. 244 were built in total. Towards the end of the First World War, the aircraft were flown by the Italian Navy Aviation, the United States Navy and United States Marine Corps Airmen. Ensign Charles Hamann won the first Medal of Honor awarded to a United States naval aviator in an M.5. The Aeromarine Plane and Motor Company modified the Felixstowe F.5 into Aeromarine 75 airliner flying boats, which with Aeromarine West Indies Airways flew airmail to Florida, Bahamas, and Cuba, along with being passenger carriers. The German aircraft manufacturing company Hansa Brandenburg built flying boats, starting with the model Hansa Brandenburg GW in 1916. The Austro-Hungarian firm, Lona Work, began building flying boats, starting with the Lona E in 1914 and the later, 1915, Lona L, which was copied widely. Interwar period, edit. In September 1919, British company Supermarine started operating the first flying boat service in the world, from Ralston to Le Havre in France, but it was short-lived. A Curtiss NC-4 became the first aircraft to fly across the Atlantic Ocean in 1919, crossing via the Azores. Of the 4 that made the attempt, only 1 completed the flight. Before the development of highly reliable aircraft, the ability to land on water was a desirable safety feature for transoceanic travel. In 1923, the first successful commercial flying boat service was introduced, with flights to and from the Channel Islands. The British aviation industry was experiencing rapid growth. The government decided that nationalisation was necessary and ordered 5 aviation companies to merge to form the state-owned Imperial Airways of London, IAL. IAL became the international flag-carrying British airline, providing flying boat passenger and mail transport links between Britain and South Africa using aircraft such as the short S.8 Calcutta. Flying boats of Adastra Aero SA at Zurich Horn Water Airport, yet Lieberg in the background, tilde 1920. During the 1920s, the Royal Air Force, RAF, Far East Flight performed a series of showing the flag long-distance formation flights using the newly developed Supermarine Southampton. Perhaps the most notable of these flights was a 43,500 kilometers, 27,000 mi, expedition conducted during 1927 and 1928. It was carried out by 4 Southamptons of the Far East Flight, setting out from Felixstowe via the Mediterranean and India to Singapore. Both the RAF and Supermarine acquired considerable acclaim from these flights, as well as proving that flying boats had evolved to become reliable means of long-distance transport. In the 1930s, flying boats made it possible to have regular air transport between the US and Europe, opening up new air travel routes to South America, Africa, and Asia. Foynes, Ireland and Boatwood, Newfoundland and Labrador were the termini for many early transatlantic flights. In areas where there were no airfields for land-based aircraft, flying boats could stop at small island, river, lake or coastal stations to refuel and resupply. The Pan Am Boeing 314 Clipper planes brought exotic destinations like the Far East within reach of air travelers and came to represent the romance of flight. By 1931, mail from Australia was reaching Britain in just 16 days, less than half the time taken by sea. In that year, government tenders on both sides of the world invited applications to run new passenger and mail services between the ends of the British Empire, and Qantas and IAL were successful with a joint bid. A company under combined ownership was then formed, Qantas Empire Airways. The new 10-day service between Rose Bay, New South Wales, near Sydney, and Southampton was such a success with letter writers that before long the volume of mail was exceeding aircraft storage space. A better solution to the problem was sought by the British government during the early 1930s, who released a specification calling for a new large aircraft capable of carrying up to 24 passengers in spacious comfort along with adequate room for airmail or freight, while simultaneously being capable of a cruising speed of 170 miles per hour and a range of at least 700 miles. The capacity for an extended range of 2,000 miles to serve the North Atlantic route was also stipulated. Originally intended for use by IAL, partner Qantas agreed to the initiative and undertook to purchase 6 of the new short S-23C class or Empire flying boats as well. Being ordered from aviation manufacturer Short Brothers, the Empire was reportedly hailed as being one of the world's boldest experiments in aviation, while early skeptics referred to the order less favorably as being a gamble. IAL were so impressed by the Empire that it placed a follow-on order for another 11. When combined with the original order for 28 flying boats, this was the largest single order to have ever been placed for a British civil aircraft at that time. Delivering the mail as quickly as possible generated a lot of competition and some innovative designs. One variant of the short Empire flying boats was the strange-looking Maya and Mercury. It was a 4-engined float-plane Mercury, the winged messenger, fixed on top of Maya, a heavily modified short Empire flying boat. The larger Maya took off, carrying the smaller Mercury loaded to a weight greater than it could take off with. This allowed the Mercury to carry sufficient fuel for a direct transatlantic flight with the mail. Unfortunately, this was of limited usefulness, and the Mercury had to be returned from America by ship. The Mercury did set a number of distance records before in-flight refueling was adopted. Sir Alan Cobham devised a method of in-flight refueling in the 1930s. In the air, the short Empire could be loaded with more fuel than it could take off with. Short Empire flying boats serving the transatlantic crossing were refueled over points. With the extra fuel load, they could make a direct transatlantic flight. A Handley Page H.P.54 Harrow was used as the fuel tanker. The German Dornier DuX flying boat was noticeably different from its UK and U.S build counterparts. It had wing-like protrusions from the fuselage, called sponsons, to stabilize it on the water without the need for wing-mounted outboard floats. This feature was pioneered by Claudius Dornier during the First World War on his Dornier RS, a giant flying boat, and perfected on the Dornier Wal in 1924. The enormous DuX was powered by 12 engines and once carried 170 persons as a publicity stunt. It flew to America in 1930-31, crossing the Atlantic via an indirect route over 9 months. It was the largest flying boat of its time, but was severely underpowered and was limited by a very low operational ceiling. Only 3 were built, with a variety of different engines installed, in an attempt to overcome the lack of power. 2 of these were sold to Italy. The Dornier Wal was easily the greatest commercial success in the history of marine aviation. Over 250 were built in Italy, Spain, Japan, the Netherlands and Germany. Numerous airlines operated the Dornier Wal on scheduled passenger and mail services. Wals were used by explorers, for a number of pioneering flights, and by the military in many countries. Though having first flown in 1922, from 1934 to 1938 Wals operated the overwater sectors of the Deutsche Lufthansa South Atlantic Airmail Service. Second World War, edit. PBY Catalina at Naval Air Station Jacksonville, circa 1943. The military value of flying boats was well recognized, and every country bordering on water operated them in a military capacity at the outbreak of the Second World War. Flying boats such as the PBM Mariner patrol bomber, PBY Catalina, Short Sunderland, and Grumman Goose were procured in large numbers. The Sunderland, which was developed in parallel to the civilian Empire flying boat, was one of the most powerful and widely used flying boats throughout the conflict, while Catalinas were one of the most produced ASW of the war, with over 2,661 being produced in the US alone. Flying boats were commonly utilized to conduct various tasks, from anti-submarine patrol to air-sea rescue and gunfire spotting for battleships. They would recover downed airmen and operate as scout aircraft over the vast distances of the Pacific Theater and the Atlantic, locating enemy vessels and sinking numerous submarines. In May 1941, the German battleship Bismarck was discovered by APBY Catalina flying out of Castle Archdale flying boat